Joy's marriage to Frank had begun like a fairy tale. 10 years ago, he was the man who swept her off her feet, promising her love, security, and companionship. But as the years passed, the fairy tale dissolved into a nightmare. Frank had become cruel, his sharp tongue lashing out at Joy with insults that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You are nothing but an old, ugly, useless woman," he would say to her in a very loud voice. Joy, once confident and full of laughter, now flinched at every word. She bore the brunt of her anger in silence, not for herself, but for her two children, Amina and Chike, who looked to her with innocent eyes, unaware of the storm raging around her. But despite Frank's cruelty, Joy chose to be a good wife, pouring her love into her children and her home. She prayed for a change, for the man she once loved to return, but the prayers went unanswered. Frank's betrayal came in the form of Precious, a younger, vibrant woman who seemed to embody everything he now desired. He married her without telling Joy, claiming it his right as a man. She only showed up one fateful morning. When Precious moved into their home, Joy's world crumbled further. Precious wasted no time asserting her dominance. "Joy, fetch me water," she commanded, lounging on the sofa with an aura of entitlement. Frank watched, with a satisfied smirk on his face, as Joy obeyed without a word. Precious was not just a second wife. She was a weapon Frank used to break Joy further. For months, Joy endured their abuse. She cooked, cleaned, and catered to their every demand while they ridiculed her. Amina and Chike watched in confusion and fear. Their mother's silent suffering echoed into their young minds. Joy's days were a blow of relentless toil. From the first light of dawn to the cool embrace of light, she worked tirelessly. Her hands were collapsed from scrubbing the floors. Her back ached from carrying heavy buckets of water, and her spirit bore the weight of constant insults. Precious treated her like a housemaid, backing orders while lounging in the sitting room. Her laughter ranging as Frank joined her in mockery. "You are too slow, Joy. Do you even know how to cook properly?" Precious snapped one morning as Joy struggled to prepare breakfast. The smell of burnt plantains was everywhere in the room. "You are good for nothing," Precious said as she slapped the back of Joy's head. Frank, who was sitting at the table, chuckled. "She's lucky I've even let her stay here. Who else would take an old worn-out woman like her?" His words sliced through Joy's heart, leaving wounds that no one could see. Her children, Amina and Chike, witnessed the daily humiliation in silence. They were too young to understand why their mother, once so full of life, now moved like a shadow in her own home. Amina will always cling to her mother, whispering, "Mama, don't cry," while Chike glared at Frank and Precious with childish defiance. But even their innocent love couldn't shield Joy from the despair that consumed her. Each day felt heavier than the last, and she began to wonder if her suffering would ever end. The turning point came one cool evening when Joy, exhausted from a long day of work, accidentally spilled a plate of food on Precious. Precious erupted in anger. "You clumsy idiot!" Precious screamed, grabbing a cane from the corner of the room. She flogged Joy repeatedly, the sound of the blow mingling with Amina's sobs and Chike's cries of protest. Frank watched from the doorway, his face devoid of sympathy. "She deserves it," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Maybe next time she will learn to be careful." As Precious continued to beat her, something inside Joy snapped. For the first time in years, her tear-streaked face hardened with resolve. She didn't scream or beg for mercy. Instead, she locked eyes with Precious. Her gaze was steady and unnerving. That night, as Joy nursed her wound, she made a decision. She couldn't endure this life any longer, not for herself and not for her children. Her mind raced with plans, each one darker than the last. For the first time in a decade, she felt the stirrings of power and control. The abuses intensified as the days went by, each moment more degrading than the other. Frank, who Joy had once called soulmate, took special pleasure in belittling her in front of Precious. Every meal Joy cooked, every house chore she completed, it became an opportunity for ridicule. "Look at her," Frank said one evening As Joy bent over the cool pot to stir the steaming pot of soup, hunched like an old woman. Maybe if she had stood up straight in life, she wouldn't look so pathetic now. Precious erupted into laughter, slapping her thigh as she sipped a very cold juice. Her feet propped on the table Joy had just cleaned. Pathetic isn't even the word. She looks like one of those old women at the market, trying to sell spoiled tomatoes. Honestly, I don't know how you have put up with her this long. Joy's hand trembled as she stirred the soup, the laughter cutting deeper than any physical wound. She wanted to cry, to scream, to remind Frank of the years she had spent loving and supporting him. But she couldn't. Any sign of defiance would only make things worse. Later that evening, as they ate the meal she had so painstakingly prepared, Frank and Precious found new ways to humiliate her. Joy, this soup tastes like you, bland and uninspired, Frank said, his voice laced with mockery. Precious laughed so hard she almost choked. Maybe we should get a real cook. At least then, we wouldn't have to suffer through her failures every time. Joy stood silently in the corner of the room, her head bowed, tears streaming down her face. Amina and Chike sat quietly on a mat in the corner, their wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. Mama, Chike whispered later that night, clinging to her as they lay on the tiny bed they shared. Why does Papa hate you? Don't worry, my child, she said softly, though her voice shook. One day, everything will be fine. It was a blistering afternoon when Precious crossed yet another line. Joy had spent the day fetching water from the community well, her muscles aching from the effort. As she staggered back into the house, Precious pointed at the ground where a patch of dirt had settled. Clean up that mess, Precious snapped, her voice sharp and demanding. Joy, who was exhausted and drenched in her sweat, bent to pick up the broom, but her knees buckled under her. She collapsed to the ground, and the bucket of water spilled across the floor. What is wrong with you? Frank roared, storming into the room. He yanked Joy to her feet, shaking her roughly. Can't you do anything right? Maybe she's just pretending to be weak. You know how lazy this woman can be, Precious said. Frank shoved Joy aside, sending her sprawling to the ground. Clean up this mess now, he barked, and don't let me hear another excuse. As Joy mopped up the water with trembling hands, Precious and Frank sat at the dining table, laughing and sharing jokes at her expense. Imagine being her, Precious said, with a cruel laugh. No wonder she has no friends. Who would want to associate with someone so pitiful? That night, as Joy laid on her tiny bed, with her children coiled up behind her, she stared into the tiny space. Her heart was full of pain, her eyes full of tears. She wondered if Frank was ever going to change. Joy had often thought about leaving. The thoughts crossed her mind countless times, especially the night when she lay awake, nursing the bruises on her body and the wounds in her heart. But each time she considered it, the faces of her children stopped her. Amina and Chike deserved a family, she told herself. They deserved a father in their lives, no matter how cruel he was to her. In their small village, a woman leaving her husband was unthinkable. Women were expected to endure, no matter the pain or humiliation. The whispers of the village women, the judgmental glances of the elders, and the inevitable shame her family would feel, all weighed heavily on Joy's shoulders. What will people say if I leave? She often whispered to herself. They will call me a failure, an ungrateful woman who couldn't keep her home together. When Frank sensed her fear of leaving, he used it to his own advantage. You think anyone will take you in if you leave? He mocked her one evening after Precious had slapped her for bringing warm water instead of cold water. You will be nothing but a disgrace, a laughing stock. You are too old and too useless. No man will accept you. Precious laughed, her voice tripled with mockery. She wouldn't even last a week outside this house. Let her try. She will come crawling back, Precious added. Joy bit her lip to keep from crying, her heart pounding with anger and despair. She wanted to scream, to tell them she wasn't as weak as they thought. But the thought of her children growing up without a father or enduring the ridicule of society kept her silent. That evening, as she watched her children play outside, Joy felt a fresh wave of guilt. How could she uproot their lives? How could she risk their happiness for her freedom? But deep down in her heart, Joy knew the truth. Her children weren't truly happy. They lived in fear, their innocent eyes constantly darting between her and their father, bracing for the next outburst. For all her sacrifices, she wasn't protecting them. She was teaching them to accept pain and humiliation as a way of life. The breaking point came one cool evening when Precious slapped Joy in front of Amina and Chike, accusing her of stealing sugar. "You thief!" Precious screamed, grabbing Joy by the arm and shoving her against the wall. "Mama didn't steal anything," Chike yelled, stepping forward to protect his mother. His small fist clenched and his eyes burned with defiance. Frank burst into laughter, shaking his head. "Look at this boy. He thinks he's a man now, just like his useless mother, full of empty courage." Joy quickly put Chike behind her. Her body trembled with rage. She looked at her children's terrified faces and knew she couldn't let this continue. That night, as she lay on her bed, she made her decision. She would leave, not to run away, but to save her children from this life of fear and humiliation. If society would judge her, so be it. If the villagers whispered, let them. Her children deserved better. But Joy knew leaving wasn't enough. Frank and Precious had humiliated her for years, treating her like a debt beneath their feet. They needed to pay for what they had done. Joy worked with precision the following morning. Her movements were very calm and deliberate. She knew this would be the last meal she would ever prepare for Precious and Frank. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crushed the dried leaves she had secretly gathered from the herbalist shop on the outskirts of the town. She had heard whispers of their potency, how just a pinch could silence even the strongest of men. Frank and Precious had left for the day as usual, laughing as they reminded her to have dinner ready by the time they returned. "And don't burn it this time," Frank had said to her. Precious followed her with usual smile. "You are lucky we let you stay here. Joy, if you were in your father's house, they would have thrown you out years ago." Joy swallowed her anger and nodded, as she always did. But this time, her silence wasn't out of fear. It was out of certainty. By the time they returned, the aroma of egusi soup and pounded yam covered the room. The dining table was set with the finest plates in the house, ones Precious had claimed as her own. As Frank and Precious dug into their meal, Joy stood silently by the table, her hands clasped in front of her. She watched as they laughed and mocked her between bites, ignorant to the fate that awaited them. "You have finally done something right," Precious said, smacking her lips. "Maybe you are not as useless as I thought." Frank chuckled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Don't give her too much credit. Even a broken clock is right twice a day." Joy didn't respond. She simply stood there. Her expression was blank, her heart pounding as she waited. It didn't take long. Frank was the first to clench his stomach, his face contorting in pain. Precious followed second later, dropping her spoon as she doubled over, gasping for air. What did you do?" Frank rocked, his voice barely audible. He collapsed to the ground, his body rotting in agony. Precious tried to stand but stumbled, with her breath coming in short. Joy stood over them. Her face was calm, her voice steady. "I did what I had to do," she said simply. "You made me a prisoner in my own home." That night, under the cover of darkness, Joy packed all her belongings. She woke her children, who were far asleep, and they left together. The villagers woke up the next morning to the news of Frank and Precious' mysterious death. Their lifeless bodies lay on the dining room floor. The untouched remnants of the poisoned meal was still on the table. But Joy and her children were nowhere to be found. Some said she had fled to the city. Others whispered that she had vanished into the thick forest beyond the village. No one ever saw her again. For the first time in a decade, Joy was free. She had no home, no wealth, and no certainty about the future. But as she walked into the unknown with her children by her side, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this story, please do well to subscribe. Tell me what you think about this story in the comment section.